Welcome to Ancient Geeks, a podcast where two old friends of a certain age talk about the development of geek culture from decades past to the present day. We were geeks before it was chic. I am your co-host, Stephen Taylor, and I am my own beginning and my own ending. I am the guardian of the pod.
Ooh, and I'm Tom Grant, and I'm actually a robot that will survive the next 1,000 years so that we can preserve what's best about our culture, such as Waldorf salad.
Excellent. Excellent.
So we'll never be
That's
fresh out of Waldorf's.
that's as long as you have a mayonnaise sauce. Anyway,
Yes.
um, today on Ancient Geeks, as I get distracted by the Waldorfs, we continue our discussion of the life and work of Harlan Ellison. Today we're talking about Harlan's forays into television, at least some of them. So before we get into that, Tom, what have you been doing this week in geek?
Well, I purged long ago my physical copy of Alfred Bester's "The Star Is My Destination,"
Mm-hmm.
which, since we're on the subject of Harlan Ellison, Bester was somebody whom Ellison cited as a big influence. And
Yes.
he's a noted uh, s- golden age science fiction writer, did some really interesting experimental stuff. Anyway, so I was glad to get a physical copy of the paperback again. But I also pulled out of storage the Howard Chaykin adaptation that was done, I
Oh
think,
yeah,
in the
yeah, yeah.
70s. Yeah, which I forgot I still owned. One of the few survivals from the Great Purges. So anyway, it was nice just to assemble these two items, which are now going to go side by side on my bookshelf.
So the only thing that I've been doing in addition to all the Ellison diving is I have been continuing my re-listen of the Old Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio series, and just reminding myself consistently of how fantastic it was. And I'll encourage you again to listen to that second series at least, because it's worth your time.
Okay, I will do that.
So, yeah, we like to assign homework here on Ancient Geeks. Anyway, so if you could pick a song as the soundtrack for this episode, what would you select, Tom?
It's not exactly a song, but I would pick the Outer Limits intro.
That works.
Yeah, since we're going to be talking about a couple of Outer Limits episode, and if you listener have not ever watched an Outer Limits episode, you're missing out. I'll just say that. Why deprive yourself further? There's some great television, science fiction
To
television there.
more homework. But
More
so
homework.
I
Well,
found I was
it's as a
good.
reciprocal homework, so we're going to be mutual assured homework throughout this
Destruction
episode. Yes.
mutually assured. Ah well. So I found a song called Harlan Ellison by a guy named Eric Peter Schwartz. And the first line of that song is will you sue me, Harlan Ellison, the way you sued James? I just messed it up. Will you sue me, Harlan Ellison, the way you sued James Cameron? That just seemed appropriate for this episode.
Yes, it sure does. It's a funny song.
Let's talk about TV and Harlan Ellison. There's a couple different things I wanted to discuss as I've lost my notes. There they are. Gee whiz, Stephen. Okay.
Pull yourself together, man.
That's right. I'm discombobulated. Okay. So I think, again, there's a lot you can talk about with Ellison and television. I think
And we
today
will.
and we will, we won't cover everything today. There's one more episode after this. We'll talk a little bit more about it. But, and really most specifically his foray into movies, or a movie in particular. But I want to talk a little bit about the way he talked about television,
Mhm.
both in terms of just his persona, to link back to things we keep coming back to, his foray into TV criticism, and then I want to talk about, as you've already alluded to, his Outer Limits episodes, and specifically his very famous Star Trek episode, City on the Edge of Forever. So
Mhm.
let's just talk a little bit, though, about how Harlan talked about television. And I'll go ahead and preface it in the following way. To me, he talks about television in some ways the same way he talks about being classified as a sci-fi writer, which is to
Right.
say he holds it in contempt, yet somehow he did an awful lot of it
Of it. Yes.
and clearly enjoyed being on television, right?
Yes.
We made reference in the first episode in this Ellison escapade that Ellison excursion we've been on, which was he was on the Tom Schneider show quite frequently as a guest,
Hmm.
and was an entertaining guest. But
Yes. And they
one of
talked a lot
those,
about television,
and they
on
did,
television.
yes.
And
So
in fact, he knocked the network. So Ellison would knock the network that they were on
yes,
that show.
yes.
Yeah.
To Snyder's dismay at times, it appeared.
Yes. There was some polite laughter. Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
That- although I guess in that regard, Ellison was the who made the way for Letterman, who constantly made fun of NBC and
oh, yeah.
CBS
Yeah.
when he was at his show, or even now.
Brilliantly. Brilliantly. Those are some of the
Absolutely.
funniest parts of Letterman show.
I just remember the bit where he had to put coins in the camera to keep it
Oh,
operating.
yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And then even to this day with John Oliver, who talks about his TV daddy or whatever,
Right.
corporate daddy, which should be very interesting when HBO is acquired by Paramount. Anyway, moving right along.
Moving
So
along.
well, let's talk about the Snyder stuff, and then we can talk about the Glass Teeth,
Okay.
which I have not read and you have. I'm flipping
Yeah.
my own outline here, but so one of the I mean, there are multiple clips of Harlan on Schneider's show. One that we both watched was, I don't know if I wrote it down this way or it's entitled this way on YouTube, but Why Television is Made for Morons,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And it really is a great deal of Harlan ranting about interference by producers, his desire that the writer be paramount, and all this kind of stuff, right? He does he and if you watch this clip, you do get a lot of kind of what I was referring to some last episode and maybe even the first episode, where he is extolling the value of quality, about his concern about the TV promotes mediocrity and how art is so important to him, right?
Hmm. Yes.
All of which I don't have a problem. I mean, in the abstract, I agree that a lot of TV is mediocre, if not bad, or in the lingua of this podcast, a lot of it's pretty meh,
Hmm.
if not bad. I do think that writers are often ignored to the detriment often of productions,
Yes.
although not always. And I would like to see art elevated and mediocrity tamped down. But in my opinion, he doesn't ever define any of this stuff except to say that whatever he does is not. It boils down to this, and you
Yeah.
tell me if I'm wrong. It seems that art is what Harlan writes. The non-mediocre is what Harlan writes, and it's all about a subjective sort of category where Harlan's in the good category, and a lot of other things are not. Not everything, but
Right.
most things are in the
Right.
other category, and that's the definition. Am I missing something, Tom?
No, I think that's probably fair. I think that actually a lot of Ellison's screeds about television remind me a lot of similar sorts of complaints by Rod Serling, though I think
Yes,
Rod Serling was better at articulating what good television would look like.
correct.
And certainly he was the source of a lot of that, not just the Twilight Zone, but Playhouse 90 and other kind of serious drama that he did over the
Yes.
years. Ellison, I don't know, so for example, like there is his famous conflict with the producer of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea.
Hmm.
And I went and I watched that episode of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea that Ellison wrote and then had his name taken off and put on a pseudonym so that he would get
Yeah.
paid.
Right.
I could kind of guess maybe what he thought was art or what he was trying to do
Hmm.
that was important. There was a character in the story who's a German scientist, and because he's somebody who worked in the Third Reich,
Right.
he's the target of a lot of opprobrium by people on the Sea View, the
Hmm.
submarine that
Right.
is the one set of the TV show. And okay, maybe they toned it down a little bit or made that storyline less central. I don't know. But how much more art could you put into it than saying, well, maybe, we need to talk about Operation Paperclip and what the US should or shouldn't have done and how we should treat these people now and so forth. But that's not necessarily high art. It's challenging. And I think there's a lot of
Right.
value to being challenging, get
Sure.
people to think about things they don't normally think about or think about them in new ways. But I don't think it's necessarily great art.
Right. And I'm going to hold it as I want to digress, but I'll go ahead and point out it is difficult to know exactly always what Harlan was objecting to because we have to guess. But we
Hmm.
do have a comparison we can make in a few minutes here. We'll talk
Oh yeah,
about his original
yeah.
script is Sitting on the Edge of Forever and the one that was actually aired. And
Which is a Star Trek episode. We should just
Star
say for
Trek, yeah.
people who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah.
For the two people listening to this who are not familiar with it.
What is this Star Trek?
Yes.
Kiss. What is Kiss? We have to guess what he thought was missing. And what I believe to be the case to some degree, and this is like evidenced in his own writing, though, in the various introductory essays and the various volumes and from interviews, I think mostly he just didn't like to be told he had to change anything, or he wanted it done the way he thought it needed to be done, right?
Hmm.
I understand, as I think I may have said in the first episode in this series, I've been edited and I've been told to change things. I've been told to take things out. I mean, I'm not Harlan Ellison and I'm not writing literary stories, but I mean, I understand it can be annoying. Uh, the person who writes something typically thinks that they're right, although I will admit that having an editor is actually a very good thing. But I think Ellison just didn't want to be told what to do, and then in his own brain decided that when he was told what to do, that was mediocrity, and he needed to do exactly what he wanted to do was art and quality, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he even said in that interview with Schneider that we talked about that compromise. He doesn't like compromise. He says something
Hmm.
along the lines of because they're going back and forth. He and Schneider are going back and forth about interference by the suits, basically. And Snyder says, isn't life sometimes about compromise, working together to accomplish something, which I think is a perfectly reasonable thing to say.
Yes.
And then Harlan basically rolls his eyes and says, oh, that's what politicians say. And then he started to talk about how the fact that when he was a kid, he was called slurs and
Hmm.
beat up. And somehow that therefore he thinks life is confrontation, basically. And I think that what we find looking at a lot of this work that he does, that he could have gotten more out of life. Certainly, from if you wanted to get more of his work on screen,
Hmm.
if you work with people, right? Because it
Yeah.
is to get. I agree that the writer is central and the writer should be elevated, but TV and movie making is a collaborative process, right? And you can't have one person who has all the say.
Yes.
And to go back to the, because yeah, I remember watching that clip of Rod Serling on the Dick Cavett show talking about these kinds of
Hmm.
things, and you sent that clip to me the other day, and it can be found pretty easily. And he does bemoan there and other places that you read, either again Serling interviews or things that he wrote. He was very frustrated by the interference with his writing, and I
Hmm.
clearly understand the pain of being rewritten if you're writing a teleplay or whatever. Although I think one of the things that I find more sympathetic about Serling's point of view than Ellison's necessarily is this. Serling was writing for a particular kind of medium where it really was about that one story.
Hmm.
And if you're making, I think, you're making a episode of The Twilight Zone, which is self-contained, or making a movie that is self-contained, then the writer probably should have more preeminence. If you're writing for episodic television, there are more constraints by definition, right?
Right.
Because you don't
Well,
create the characters, you just create the scenario for the characters to play in for that episode.
right. Yeah. So I think there's so let's just rewind a little bit, some context here. So
Sure.
uh, before I get into it, I would also
No, I
recommend
refuse to
people.
compromise on my original statement. It was art and it was pure quality.
I stand in awe before your
Of
artistic
course.
wonderfulness.
Yes, you should.
So before I get into the context here, I just want to say also there's another good YouTube video. There's a Library of Congress interview with Rod Serling
Hmm.
that I would recommend. It's longer than the one with Dick Cavett, and he has a lot more to say. And it's all, I think, good to understand where he was coming from, which I think is
Hmm.
very similar to Harlan Ellison's. So I think what made people prickly about script writing in Hollywood at the time was, first of all, the out and out censorship that
Hmm.
happened because of fear of the sponsors
Yes.
and
Yes.
and by extension the audience, so
Yes.
that if you did something that was, too cutting edge, too confrontational, too much interested in social justice issues or
Right.
whatever, that the sponsors would and did
Yes.
weigh in on that. And then there was a prudishness to it as well. And so,
Yes.
like in his collection of essays, uh, The Glassed Heat, and also there's a second one, Another Glassed Heat, all these columns that Ellison wrote for the LA Free Press. Like he comes in defense of the Smothers Brothers, who were
Hmm.
famously locked in mortal combat all the time with the censor, with the
Yes.
network executives over things that they were told they couldn't do because it was too risque or too political or
Hmm.
too whatever.
Right.
And Laugh In, the skit comedy show, which I watched a lot when I was a kid, would constantly be in, it's sort of this game of cat and mouse with the censor where they would
Yes.
try to get away with things. Like I
Yes.
just remember like rewatching some old episodes, and Dick Martin comes out and says, "Big Dick here." So or I remember Joanne Worley like holding up some crescent rolls and saying buns, just to kind
Yes.
of
Yes.
stick it
Yes.
in the face of the censors. So there was that sort of
Sure.
sensitivity, but there was also a lot of like mucking around by people who were network executives in ways that didn't even necessarily have to do with what the censors wanted, or what the audience demanded. And so you'd have situations where somebody like Serling would write a script. It would be a script about racism. They'd make a
Yes.
character black, and then somebody would tell them, "No, you have to change
Yeah. Right.
that person to a white person." So just
Right.
kind of ridiculous interference that
Oh, I
often
agree.
ran completely contrary to the point of what they were writing.
How about this? I mean, I agree with all that. And I think also the
Mhm.
era in which we especially talk about the 50s and the 60s
Right.
into the 70s, um, sort of, I think the confluence of any number of industry constraints and to include the fact that, it's just three networks and that creates all kinds of control issues and also the preeminence
Mhm.
of advertisers. I mean, after all, the reason TV was free is because it got paid for by advertisers, right? I mean,
Right.
so this whole problem that we continue to have with other kinds of electronic media these days. But so I'm not at all. I am not saying, just to be clear, if I'm not being clear, that there isn't real interference, real problematic activity, and often like some corporate goon decides that
Mhm.
that I don't want to have the story shouldn't be about it shouldn't be a dog. It should be a porpoise because porpoises are kind of funny. That kind of thing. I
Right.
realize you get that kind of. I think
Or
my
the number
problem.
of monkeys in Japanese animation
Right,
and
exactly.
and Hanna-Barbera cartoons
Can
that
it
we talked
can it
about.
have a can it have a monkey? Or we
How
need
can we get
a
a monkey into this?
we need a child so that the kids can have someone to relate to, or whatever. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not. There's all kinds of interference that's problematic, and I'm not saying that everything anyone ever said to Harlan Ellison was wrong. I just what I find problematic about his approach to it is a flat circle of undifferentiation between all the criticisms. It's like any criticism
Right.
is co-equal.
Right. It's not to say that all interference was bad.
That's right. Or that
Yeah.
all things you have to do to make a TV show. I mean, if you're going to, again, so here's a simple example. I'll draw from Star Trek, but it would probably apply to Voyage to the Bottom of
Hmm.
the Sea or any other show. One of the things that he did in that script was add other officers as part of the story. And that's fine, but when you already have an ensemble
Hmm.
cast and you add in two other characters who become central to the story, I can understand how a producer might say, we already have actors we're employing.
Yeah.
We don't need somebody we've never heard of to show up this week. No, maybe you should sometimes. But I can understand why, from a budget point of view, or a story writing point of view, or story editing point of view, you might decide that's not, we don't want to do it that way.
Hmm.
And I think you can still tell the story you want to tell, even if you have to adhere to that particular stricture, for example, right?
Hmm.
So, I mean, another sort of, or actually, one this came to mind out of nowhere, a bad example of interference. So, I don't know, do you remember? And it's somewhat thematic because it's about J. Michael Straczynski, who was a friend of Harlan Ellison's, and it had to do with the sequel series to Babylon 5 Crusade.
Hmm.
Did you ever watch Crusade?
Yeah. I never finished it, but I
Well,
watched
there's
about half of
not
it.
much of it because it got
Hmm.
canceled. But like with the interference in Firefly, that show got shown out of production order because to appease something that
Hmm.
the powers that be wanted. And one of the things that an executive insisted that there be a fist fight. So Straczynski wrote a script specifically for the very first episode that starts with a fist fight just to prove a point. That kind of thing is ridiculous. You shouldn't be telling the
Right.
author that kind of thing. So I get that. It's just I think you have to have some kind of recognition that it is a team sport,
Yeah.
right? That's
Yeah.
that's the part that I find off-putting.
Yeah. We'll get into kind of the examples of quote unquote interference, not just in this episode, but the next one too.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. And then the other
Yeah.
the other thing that I find of interest, at least, is well, we've beat to death perhaps the discussion of interference, but then the issue of quality versus mediocrity and what that really
Hmm.
means. Because I just don't
Yeah.
know that he has an objective standard that he's living by. Do you?
There's not a like a 10-point plan for how to create a quality script. So I no, I don't see a clear standard. I don't know like what distinguishes a really good episode of The Outer Limits in his mind from
Right.
a mediocre episode of Bonanza.
Right. That's fair. Well, and then there's another quote from that interview, and I think this in some ways gets to
Mhm.
the heart of all of it, which he says that loyal to the work is, quote, that's my religion. And I think that's part of the
Mhm.
problem. He has his own idea about the way it's supposed to be, and that's all that matters.
Right.
And hence the conflict. But anyway,
Anyway.
but yeah. But as he says, life is confrontation. So there you
Mhm.
go. Um, there's another episode where he's there with some of the cast from Star Trek. That's also
Mhm.
kind of interesting because he's a little
Yes.
he's pretty confrontational with them as well. He and James Doohan get into a bit of an argument about whether Star Trek was a cop show or not.
I know.
And Doohan looks like, why am I here? Like, what?
Money.
Yeah, well, there's that. Yeah, he and Kenny get into a little bit too as well. Anyway,
Yeah.
um, okay,
And by
so
the way, I having spent a day with Dewan one time in the
yeah,
past, he was a pretty easygoing guy. So
that
that
was
was
my
a
impression actually.
yeah, yeah. It was interesting to see him get his back up a little bit.
I was not surprised that Walter Canning was confrontational,
Yeah,
but the one
yeah.
time I saw him once at the only Trek conference I ever convention I
Mhm.
ever went to, and he clearly did not want to be there. Just did not. But the paycheck was pretty good.
Yeah. Boy, that was like
Anyway,
running into Chuck Norris at a San Diego Comic-Con. It's like, yeah, this guy does not want to be here.
so I've never read any of the Glass Teat or the other Glass Teat, and I in fact toyed with trying to find a copy, but it's incredibly expensive. At least the ones that I found.
Mhm.
Is there anything about you've read some of them? Is there anything about those you want to comment on before we
Well,
move
as
on
I
to some
said
other
last
things?
episode, I think it's a good medium for him in that it's constrained. He doesn't kind of fall into his bad habits of overwriting. It's also very incidental, and so like you're reading it, I kind of skipped around a bit, and he was reacting a lot to things that were happening, and
Hmm.
a lot of it, what he had to say was dead on. Like he really, for example, thought that like he talks about an interview with Jean-Claude Killy, the
Hmm.
French skier, where
Hmm.
the interviewer was a jackass to him.
Hmm.
Um, and it sounded very credible,
Right.
and good for him. And he was trying to make a point about how Americans sometimes treat people from other societies.
Hmm.
In sort of this ugly American way that the interviewer was doing. He also has like an interesting story about how He was on Joe Pine's show. If you don't, people who don't know who Joe Pine is, he was sort of a precursor to Rush Limbaugh and
Oh, that's
all of
right.
these,
I know the name.
sort of right wing radio and TV personalities, and how Ellison kind of went on loaded for bear. He was ready to do battle, and then like Pine and the co-host were just really nice to him. He just found himself completely disarmed in the situation. Anyway, I just
Boy, they must have
Ellison.
been really nice to him to disarm Harlan Ellison.
Oh yeah, but anyway, he was. It was nice to kind of see him, as I said, not overwrite, be a good
Yeah,
storyteller,
yeah.
talk about things that were indeed good and bad about television at the time.
Hmm.
I really enjoyed those essays. And again, I haven't read the whole book cover to cover again, but I really enjoyed those essays and what he had to say about the medium.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I mean, this is a side note, in accepting at least the one essay that we talked about
Hmm.
in the previous episode, I find that a lot of his nonfiction writing is narratively more satisfying than his fiction sometimes.
Yes.
Because he actually has his story he's trying, by definition, he's telling, right?
Yeah, and he hasn't embellished it like after multiple repetitions
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
same story. That I
that's
think
right.
that comes out from reading these essays as well. I should say
So,
columns, not essays.
and I'll say, I mean, I guess we do agree that he has a love-hate relationship with television. And
Yes. Oh,
actually, I think he loves it
by
more than he hates it, actually.
by the way,
Go ahead.
he also repeatedly makes fun of Ralph Williams, the used car guy who used to be ubiquitous on television in Southern California at the time of the writing.
He was the
He was
pre,
the yes,
yeah, the pre-Cal Worthington,
he
right?
was the pre-Cal Worthington, exactly.
Cal Worthington was my guy.
Yeah,
We
so
moved
my
to
guy too.
California, and he
Yeah,
was Cal Worthington and his dog Spot. But if you
yeah.
need a car truck, go see Cal.
And if you find a lower price, I'll eat a bug.
That's right. I forgot. Ah, oh well. Old school TV.
Memories.
Now we have our various attorneys trying to tell us that they too can win us $1 million.
Yes.
Anyway, Ellison, as we've already talked about in the previous episodes, was a very prolific short story writer, essayist, but he also, especially in the 1960s and the early 70s, was, and into the 80s too, but he was a script writer for television. I think, I'm sure in part because it paid pretty well, right?
Yes.
And he wrote scripts for a bunch of TV, right? So like I just have a partial list route the things that we would know, I think. Route 66, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, Burke's Law, The Man from Uncle, an
Hmm.
episode of The Flying Nun, which I find hilarious that I've already mentioned, something called Somewhere on
Can't wait to
Script.
find that someday.
Yeah, I need to look it up. And the Young Lawyers. And of course, famously wrote two stories for The Outer Limits and the Star Trek
Yes.
episode we're going to talk about. And then later, other stuff that he did, a show we'll talk about next episode called The Star Lost. And he also was a consultant on Babylon 5 and wrote a script for at least some stories for the scripts on Babylon 5 and was the story editor and wrote some stories for the revival of The Twilight Zone in the 80s. So he's was in TV for quite a while in
Hmm.
various manifestations, despite his frustration with the business, right?
Yes. And the arbitrariness of it. I mean,
Sure.
that's what you kind of feel about his recounting of his contacts with TV producers and so forth. Is just how random it all feels.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
unfair. Like he obviously feeling like he was unfairly dealt with, or his work was mucked with in ridiculous ways and so forth. Unlike his fiction writing, which was all right, he had editors to deal with,
Right.
but it was a lot more manageable process than the crazy world of Hollywood.
That's true. Although I do have to wonder, getting back to a point that we made last episode about the degree how reliable a narrator he is about
Hmm.
his own stories. You do have to wonder if he showed up in someone's office already assuming that they're an idiot, if that may have had some
Yeah.
some influence on how the meeting went.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, again, to go back to the glass teeth, it's interesting to read how he's willing to kind of say how hoodwinked he was. Like I didn't find it yet, but I
okay.
distinctly remember he wrote like a column where he was talking about how this oil company was going to be coming out with some new additive that was going to be ecologically
Right.
friendly and so forth. And then he wrote another column saying, okay, I was totally bamboozled. I was wrong.
Oh yeah,
These people misled me. So again, I think that was a very good medium for him.
yeah, yeah. I agree.
Mhm.
So let's talk a little bit about some of this stuff that's classic, right? I mean,
Classic.
so I don't know. I mean, we did talk about it some when we talked about the Terminator.
We should also explain what Outer Limits is before we get into the
Sure,
episodes.
you go ahead and
Yeah,
explain.
so Outer Limits was on in the early 1960s, and it was an anthology TV show in black and white because TV shows were still in black and white at the time. It was a different story every episode, much like other anthology shows of the time, like Alfred Hitchcock Presents or The Twilight Zone or whatever. It was an hour long, so they could tell
Hmm.
an extended story, and the stories were, I would say, uh, not restrained. They were often very weird.
Hmm.
I think if you wanted to, as a science fiction writer in the mold of Harlan Ellison, wanted to shop something someplace, this may have been one of the best places on TV to go to.
Oh, I agree with that. I
Yeah.
think that that program suited his skill set quite well.
Yeah, and
Um,
there are episodes that I happily rewatch to this day, not just the Harlan Ellison ones, but the Zanti Misfits, which is one of the most freaky episodes of television I encountered in my early life. And without anything away, the bad guys in it are really creepy. And it has like an early Bruce Stern appearance in it, which is kind of
mm,
fun too. Or, there are other ones. There's an episode, The Bolero Shield, which has an interesting connection to ufology, the Barney and Betty Hill kidnapping, sorry, abduction. Part of their recollection that they told to a hypnotist was
mm.
arguably a memory of watching that episode of The Outer Limits, where
Oh, okay. Yeah,
there's a
yeah.
great episode about living in a surveillance society that is one of my faves. Anyway, it was a great show. It went on for only 2 seasons, but it was like a a a science fiction magazine brought to the screen.
Hmm. Hmm. I think that's fair. So the two episodes that Ellison wrote were Demon with a Glass Hand and Soldier, both of which have been linked, at least in popular discourse, with Terminator because they have at least some elements
Mm.
in common. Although I think, if I understand Ellison, it was Soldier that he thought was stolen, not Demon with a Glass Hand. But nonetheless, there was a lawsuit. It was settled out of court. Ellison got some, at least, credit on subsequent releases of the show, of the movie.
Mm.
As we talked about at the time, as should be clear in a moment, I don't know that you really had a basis for a lawsuit, but hey,
Yeah,
I'm
and
no
I
attorney.
I thought of something I'll bring up when we get through Demon with the Glass Hand that I think is really why that lawsuit
Well,
it wasn't based on the firmest grounds.
so you want to give a quick synopsis of Deal with the Glass Hand, and then we can get
Yeah, so
to.
Demon with the Glass Hand starts with the main character Trent, played by Robert Culp, who is on the run. There are aliens hunting him. He says he just kind of came sui generis into existence. He doesn't have any
Mhm.
memories of his past. He just knows he has to escape these people, and he has instead of a normal hand, one of his hands is made out of glass or some glass-like material,
Mhm.
and it has a computer on it that talks to him.
And this is where the
And
phrase "talk to the hand" came from.
there, exactly, it did. Thank you for that little bit of
Sure, it's trivia. I try to inform people so they know
yes.
things.
Yeah, come for the geek memories, stay for the word origins. So that's the basis of the story. And then, as you might imagine, through the course of the story, there's more revealed about the aliens, about Trent, about why he's on the run, what, he get more fingers added,
Yeah,
it gets
he
more,
keeps getting the finger,
the
and then he
fingers gets
gets
getting the finger.
more. Yeah, and then he more information. Yeah.
So each finger provides more memory and, kind of more information about what's going on. There's a time travel essential element to
Yes.
this that
Yes.
he and the aliens who are hunting him, who are humanoid,
Hmm.
but they've been converted to be able to pass as humans, but in their normal
Yeah, they're
form,
aliens.
they're
They're
definitely
aliens.
aliens.
The whole thing is about a conflict in the far future, and
Mhm.
he's a guardian of humanity, and these aliens are
Yes,
trying to wipe humanity out. That's the basic
right.
notion.
Yeah, and there's
And so
something he has that will complete their
yeah,
eradication of humanity.
and the one, I mean, the similarity with Terminator is it's time travel,
Yes.
and one of the creatures is basically a robot. Okay, beyond that, not so similar. I will. In the episode is filmed almost exclusively in the Bradbury Building in Los Angeles.
Hmm.
This is a very well filmed script. I'll go ahead and say this, and to give Harlan credit for being more flexible than sometimes maybe he seems. I do know that reading, doing some research for this episode, that he had originally written a different location for the script, and he was asked by the producers to limit the location because of cost, and he was able to rewrite the script to accommodate that goal, so he wasn't always
Right.
recalcitrant always.
Yeah. And what they did was they said that the aliens had put an invisible shield around the building so nobody could escape.
Lots of
And
invisible things in the 50s and 60s, like
yeah.
the invisible spaceship in one episode of Star Trek, because we can't afford a model.
Well,
Anyway,
and I did, and the Bradbury building is really cool. So
it's totally cool.
it's
Yeah,
yeah, a fun place to have an episode like this shot.
agreed. So, what was your thought about the lawsuit in this episode?
So there are lots and lots and lots of stories about people time traveling into the past to prevent some future calamity.
Right.
And you might think that's like painting things with too broad a brush, but what this reminded me of was that so we find out that Trent is actually a robot,
Yes.
and he's a robot constructed to preserve humanity, in spite of the fact that the world has been devastated, the aliens have conquered it. But if there's ever an opportunity to rebuild, then humanity and all of its knowledge and culture and so forth has been preserved in this one robot. So robots sent back in time from the future, the future of humanity is at stake. There was a book called Brother Assassin. It was one of the Berserker books written by Fred Saberhagen.
Hmm.
So Saberhagen wrote these stories in which there was this relentless machine civilization that was out to annihilate humanity, and
Were they out to
most
exterminate?
exterminate. Uh,
Yes.
and so in this case, the most of the stories, most of them are short stories, but there were some novels, were set in the future. Interesting conflicts in each story, an interesting situation that played out. But this particular novel was about a robot assassin sent into the past, to like back into like the equivalent of the Renaissance on this one planet, and then kind of kill somebody there who was essential to the future of the human race. In any case, I think that had way more resemblance to
Hmm.
the Terminator
Right.
than did either Demon with the Glass Hand or the Soldier. And it's not unique to Brother Assassin, the Saberhagen novel. Again, if you dig
Right.
long enough, you'll find other uses of this particular motif in stories for decades. But
No, I
that
think
but
this
that's
is
just me.
accurate.
Yeah.
No, I think that to that point, and part of my joke about exterminate is, again, that sounds like Daleks. I mean, the idea of these are motif is a good word. The idea of traveling back in time to change something, or the
Hmm.
idea, or to pick another example again, berserker robots that are relentless. These are, I don't think you can copyright these ideas. Um, and suing of them seems to be a bit over the top, if not a bit egotistical, quite frankly.
Hmm.
I think the problem was that Cameron said at some point he was influenced by some Outer Limits episodes, and Ellison went and ran with that because
Hmm.
Cameron said it in public. And I understand, right? You get back to the persona. Harlan he was litigious by nature, and often was quite obsessed with being paid for his ideas, which I can appreciate, but perhaps a bit overwrought in this case. But Demon with the Glass Hand is a very entertaining episode.
Yeah, it's one of the best episodes of Outer Limits, a series that I praised not too long ago.
So then there's Soldier.
Hmm.
Soldier is also Soldier actually does have a little more structural resemblance, at least the beginning, to Terminator, right? It shows a
Hmm.
future battleground. Um, it um, it because of an event in the future sends back two soldiers into the past, who then basically one gets captured by American authorities, and the scientist tries to reprogram him basically or rehabilitate him so they can live in society. But then the other soldier shows up and they fight to the death and blah blah blah. Okay, and it's also good. It's a lot of it's more about the psychologist and how he's trying to
Hmm.
communicate with this alien from the future, basically, and less about the killing and violence part as you find in the Terminator. And it was Michael Ansara, who was on played a Klingon on Star Trek, was in it. It was a good
Hmm.
episode. And although again, it's really not the same story. In that case, the soldier wasn't trying to change the future. It was just happened to be from the future, right?
Right.
Am I missing anything about that you think needs to be said?
No, I mean, I just on the individual episodes, I think they're well cast.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned Michael Ansara, who I don't know. I mean, his casting in this was I inevitably think about Kang from
Yeah, that's right. It's
the
impossible not
Day
to.
of the Dove, and he was a guy who just was good at playing someone like you don't F with this guy. Like
That's right.
Kang was like the Klingon captain is like clear. He was a formidable person, and here
Right.
he does a good job as this soldier from the future.
Mhm.
He's wearing a ridiculous uniform and
Yes.
he has a goofy looking gun, but
Yes.
Ansara really still carries it. There's some other memorable people in it. Lloyd Nolan, I think, is just not as good in this as in other things that he played in. Tim O'Connor, who pops up all over the place in 50s, 60s, and 70s television and movies. Okay, he's Buck Rogers, right? Isn't he?
No, I mean, I don't. Gil Gerard was Buck Rogers later, but I don't know who
No,
was
no,
Buck Rogers
not Doc
before.
Rogers. No, the doctor, Doctor whatever.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Dr. Hewer.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
you're right. Yes, yes, yes. I'm
yeah.
sorry. My brain was not going to the right place. Yes.
Yes. Well, my brain frequently does not go to the right place. It's always in
Yeah,
the wrong
he
place.
was actually he was good in that.
Yeah, but anyway, he's sort of a staple of these sorts of things. And
Yes, he
anyway, he
was.
plays a police detective who is incredulous about what's being claimed here about this guy being from the future. In Demon with the Glass Hand, Robert Culp, I don't know, was one of those guys, very watchable, but always
Yes.
like a little tense and weird.
Yes.
And I think that worked well for this particular role where he's playing a robot from the future who doesn't understand what he is.
I always liked Robert Culp even as a kid, right? That was
Yeah.
like that's one of the reasons why it was a ridiculous show, but The Greatest American Hero I found amusing because Robert Culp was amusing in it to me
Yeah. Yeah.
as the FBI guy, or an I Spy
Yeah.
as the anyway as a spy. Anyway,
Right.
spoilers.
Yes. So Arlene Martell in that, is the
Hmm.
woman who also pops up in Star Trek as
Hmm.
T'Krang. Although the whole idea that she's falling in love with Trent is kind of
No, it makes no
silly.
sense.
Makes no sense.
It
The
makes
stock
no sense.
the stocking-headed aliens were a little
Yeah,
silly. The kind
yeah,
of the way that they did with the big black raccoon eyes,
yeah.
the
I
circles
agree.
around their eyes. But the guy, you hear him more than you see him, who is the leader. Like you hear him taunting Trent in the echoing bowels of the Bradbury building. That guy
Right.
was pretty good. So I mean, like a lot of like good character actors from this era in both of these episodes.
No, agreed. Agreed. So here's a question that I did not write in the outline, but I think I've mentioned to you before,
Mhm.
which is okay. These are good episodes. I'm not going to argue they're not good episodes. As you point out, they may be among the best episodes of this particular TV series.
Mhm.
I enjoyed these two episodes more than many Twilight Zone episodes we watched, also by comparison. They're good.
Mhm.
But then when we look at Ellison ranting on Tom Snyder about the preservation of art and how TV rots your brain and all this kind of stuff, how how would you reconcile 2 entertaining hours of television with that more, I think, overly elevated view of television or what it should be. I mean, how about this? I'm asking the question very awkwardly. Do you think these 2 episodes of television aspire to the kind of high-brow critique that he makes of television? This would transcend his concern about TV.
I don't. I think that they're good ripping yarns. I
Hmm.
think they're based on very good ideas. So from a science fiction perspective, although he
Yes.
didn't like calling himself a science fiction writer,
Right.
from a science fiction perspective, the ideas are good.
Yes.
Uh, I find like the dialogue's pretty good, sometimes kind of
Hmm.
stilted.
Yes.
You know, I thought like you could really tell Harlan Ellison's influence in like the voiceovers at the beginning and ending.
Yes.
Like when he throws in a reference to Gilgamesh in Demon with a
Yes.
Glass
Yes.
Hand, it's like,
Yes. Yes.
I
Yes.
know who wrote that. But it doesn't even but it doesn't have to try to be great art,
No, I agree with you. No,
I
they've stood the test of time. People know these episodes. They are
mhm,
entertaining.
mhm.
I just I have a hard. It's the same problem I had with some of the way he talked about his short stories. It makes me be more critical. How about this? His own standard that he lays down makes me therefore more critical of his work because he supposedly puts himself on this mountaintop.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
But
Yeah,
it's
but it
good
doesn't have
TV.
to be. So they stand up on their own. And
Yeah, I
maybe,
agree. I
at this
agree.
point in history, we don't have to keep, trying to, kind of ask is it art with a capital A or not?
Sure.
You could say maybe like there's television that is profound once you think about it a little more. Like
Hmm.
I think it like Mad Men,
Hmm.
as a show.
Yes.
Like superficially, it's a story about a
Madman.
unfaithful an unfaithful ad executive who
Yes.
has a mysterious past and anyway life and at a turning point in America and beneath that there's a lot of important things being talked about
Right.
about that era, about America, about other things. You can't necessarily take that show just at face value from like
Correct.
watching one
Agreed.
episode, and giving like a brief plot synopsis of it. Um, could you say that about either of these 2 episodes? There's like a deeper subtext to them. Yeah, no.
No, no. And of course, to be fair,
Hmm.
Mad Men may be, depending on one's ranking, certainly the top 10 of all time TV show. It may be a top 5 personally TV show.
Hmm.
So it's somewhat unfair to pick the pinnacle and then compare it to lower. But I'm not disparaging you bringing it up. But I think this is part of my problem. I think with Ellison's critique, TV is mostly there to entertain, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Hmm.
I think that Dealing with a Glass Hand is probably a more stimulating of an entertainment than certainly an episode of The Bachelor, which I
Yeah.
don't even understand. And certainly no one's going to talk, I don't think, 50 years from now talking about that episode of The Bachelor the way we're
Hmm.
talking about that episode of Outer Limits. So clearly it has a certain kind of quality and staying power.
Yeah. I'd also
Um,
say, by the way, as a footnote, if you want to talk about reusing ideas,
mhm,
in Soldier, in the future that Quarlo, the main character,
mhm.
Michael Ansara's character, comes from, that there is sort of a mental relationship between the soldiers and cats.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
And so he travels back in time and like he's trying to talk to the cat
Right.
in Lloyd Nolan's household,
Yes,
as if it were one of the scouting animals from the
that's
future.
right.
And that's something that Ellison basically reuses
Yes.
for A Boy and His Dog, that there
I'd
is a
forgotten about that. That's a good
psychic
point.
bond between
Yes,
the solo character and the dog.
that's
So
right. That's a
yeah.
good point. An excellent point, in fact.
So he should have sued himself. But it's fine, you
So
know.
sort
But
of a
it's a
masturbatory lawsuit. I don't
yeah,
know.
it's the sort of thing that I think, you know, like you can just say that that's a really cool idea on the face of it, and it doesn't need to go any farther. And that
Well,
certain ideas get reused, and okay,
he
that's
could
fine.
sue himself by the fact that the two episodes are about time travel, as is the next thing we're going to talk about.
We're going to talk about, but
Right? He did like time travel
yeah.
for TV in particular for some reason.
Mhm.
Anyway,
It's a good device for some things,
sure,
for telling certain kinds of stories.
agreed. So let's talk about the next the big item,
The
and
big
as I
one.
mentioned that I mentioned in the first episode, that when did I first encounter Harlan Ellison? This is probably true about a lot of
Hmm.
fans of science fiction. It is the Star Trek the original series episode, "The City on the Edge of Forever," right?
Right.
And it's a time travel story. In simple terms, it's about encountering this portal that you can travel back in time with. Dr. McCoy is accidentally injected with a sort of hallucinogenic drug that then makes him go nutso. I was going to say bats, and then I went to nutso, and then I came with butso. Um, and by doing so, he goes back in time, somehow
Yeah.
changes the past, and then Kirk and Spock have to go back and fix it. And that's the basic story, right? So let's just, as you asked me when we were preparing for this, I'll ask back to you with it before we get into the whole Ellison of it all.
Mhm.
Where do you rank this episode of Star Trek? Because it is often cited, I think, especially in our youth, as the best episode of Star Trek.
Yeah, and I think that's lunacy.
Lunacy.
It's inherently hard to kind of name the best episode
Yes.
because to what extent is that based on personal taste? To
Yes.
what extent is that based on some sort of fidelity to what the show is about? Versus just like the inherent quality of something. I would definitely place it in the top 10. I would
Yeah, for
probably
sure.
also place it in the top 5. Is
Probably.
it a better episode than A Mock Time or The Doomsday Weapon or Balance of Terror? Those are three of my favorites.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I don't know. I don't know. And because I said like this is a good episode, it it doesn't play as much on Star Trek as
That's
those
right.
other episodes do. It's not like built into the characters and backgrounds and so forth. It's really a freestanding episode that's standing at a considerable distance from
Well,
the continuity of the rest of the show.
yes.
And there's a great tragedy in it. There's
Hmm.
some hard choices people have to make. They're in the TV script and as it was produced, some great scenes in it. But was it better than those other ones? I don't think so.
No, I think I agree with you. I mean, I think it probably would be my top five because it's a well written, well
Hmm.
acted episode, and it does
Yeah.
have a meaningful ending. But I will say this, right? To sort of harken back to something that I said in the previous episode about the way Harlan writes. He writes a lot to me like a Twilight Zone style story where there's
Right.
supposed to be a big punch at the end, right? Which is true of the two Outer Limits stories, right? We find out
Hmm.
that, oh, in fact, Robert Culp's character is in fact the guardian of all of humanity. We find that at the very end of the story to sort of make all of it more dramatic. We find at the end of Soldier, Michael Ansara's character basically sacrifices himself to save the family. That's the big punchline there. And the punchline at the end of Sitting on the Edge of Forever
Hmm.
is that, Kirk's love interest has to die to restore the timeline, right? But you could easily have written Sitting on the Edge of Forever as an Outer Limits
Hmm.
episode, right? That didn't have any of these
Yeah.
characters. Because the basic thrust of the story doesn't, as you say, doesn't require it to be a Star Trek story, which is fine.
Could you have done an episode of The Flying Nun with this story?
The only reason you
Sister
probably
Betrayal
couldn't,
has to travel back in time. No.
because aren't those
Uh,
half an hour episodes? I think you need the full
yeah.
hour.
Yeah.
Maybe it could be a two-parter. Could
Right.
be a two-parter.
Well, I have to say, I think this is the best tragedy on Star Trek, but it's not the only one. Like I think like the ending of This Side of
Oh,
Paradise is kind of tragic and that Spock has
yes,
found happiness and then
yes,
he has to give it up.
yes.
That's
Yeah.
that's tragic. And there are other tragic moments like that
No,
too
I think
in the
it's
show. But this is overall as a tragic story, this is maybe the best.
yeah, I agree with that. I do agree with that. Um, so So this is one of those things that, right, in some ways, in the realm of geek world, this is
Hmm.
one of these sort of almost legendary stories, right? That Ellison wrote a script that got rewritten, and
Hmm.
Ellison had this sort of public feud with Gene Roddenberry over time. Sometimes it receded, sometimes it grew. By the time, we get to the publication of the script itself, what year is this book published? Um, 19, probably the 90s, I guess. Um, Ellison is in full dungeon over the whole thing and just
Hmm.
unhappy with Roddenberry, period. Um, so what was your understanding as a young geek about this particular feud? Or did you have one?
Yeah, but I kind of took at face value what Ellison said about it, that it
Right.
was sufficiently messed with that we would have had a better episode, even
Right.
better episode,
Yes.
had it been just taken straight from the page that he had written onto the screen. And there was a lot of expectation, like, would we ever really see the details of the original script?
Right.
Which, I forgot when it was originally published, the script, but aside from the
Well,
graphic novel, there was a publication of the
well,
script
yeah,
itself.
this is a book right here that I have. It's Harlan Ellison's The City on the Edge of Forever. I think
Yeah.
there was a previous version of it that didn't print
Hmm.
published, but this was 1995 was the publication on this. There may have been, I think the actual script was originally published in a 1976 collection.
Hmm.
Um, this, including, I think, yeah, that was the first time it was published in 1975. So it was, but it was hard to find. I remember looking for it at one point. I remember this book being at the bookstore, but I kind of thumbed through it. I never bought it. The book that I have in my hand right now contains a very long, like 75, well, 70 pages essay by Ellison
Hmm.
detailing his grievances with Gene Roddenberry with receipts to his credit. There's like
Yeah.
photocopies of letters and telegrams and all kinds of stuff, which lend a great deal of credence to Ellison's version
Hmm.
of the story. And then there's the original teleplay, the original treatment,
Hmm.
teleplay, and some of the revisions that Ellison did. And then there are several essays at the end of the book by, let me read the whole thing, but Peter David, D.C. Fontana, David Gerald, DeForest Kelly, Leonard Nimoy, Walter Koenig, George Takei, and Melinda Snodgrass.
Hmm.
The ones from the cast members are almost basically little notes. They're not that significant. And Melinda Snodgrass, who was a writer on TNG, including the famous episode, if not mistaken, Measure of a Man.
Hmm.
Also, The Instance of Command, which we said was, I think, bad or meh. I can't remember now. Season one. Although she complains, and her essay basically is her opportunity to gripe that, yes, Roddenberry messes with your scripts. She really didn't have any firsthand
Yes.
knowledge about City, but she had her script messed with, and she didn't like that. In some degree, David Gerald's doing a similar kind of deal. The DC Fontana one's the most interesting one because it does corroborate to some degree, but in a way that's not it doesn't indict anybody. She says, look, there were like I said a minute ago, talking about
Hmm.
the extra characters. Like we already had an established cast, we already had these things. We needed to work within that parameter, and that's something a producer is not unreasonable to
Right.
want to try to
Right.
do. She points out that Gene Kuhn did part of the rewrite, that Gene Roddenberry did part of the rewrite, and she did part of the rewrite
Hmm.
actually, that then produced the final teleplay. And her story it corroborates Ellison to a degree, but it takes some of the hard edges off of it, I think, in a way that
Yeah.
kind of rings more true than Ellison's very angry screed about the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, I would say though, at the time, like before all of this came out, because we really didn't get the behind the scenes
Mm-mm.
story about what Roddenberry's role was in general in rewriting things or whatever until like the 80s and 90s.
Yes.
But originally, I wondered because, of course, Ellison had these famous dust ups with
Yes.
people in television, and you could say, well, it was just Ellison being Ellison again. But also, too, I mean, I at the time, I remember thinking, All right. So Ted Sturgeon, well-established science fiction
Right.
writer, wrote Amok Time.
Hmm.
Norman Spinrad
Hmm.
wrote The Doomsday Weapon. Why
Right.
aren't why aren't they as unhappy? Is
Right.
it just because they were just, I don't know, somehow intimidated behind the scenes, or that they just weren't the same sort of pugnacious personality that Ellison had and decided not to make a big deal of it? I don't know, but
Hmm.
it just seemed funny. Like this is a very science fiction writing friendly show,
Right.
not just the themes of the show, but actually with science fiction writers writing episodes. And Larry Niven wrote an episode of the animated
Hmm.
series.
Right.
So it's like, huh. And I didn't know quite how to square that.
So I think, yeah, I agree. So,
Hmm.
and this is, and I think this is all the piece again as I'm trying to assess because it's the way in which it's so difficult to
Hmm.
disaggregate as you keep pointing out Ellison's persona
Yeah.
and Ellison's work. Um, I think that one is, I think his lack of interest in compromise, as reflected in the Snyder interviews, is part of the
Hmm.
problem. So I think in some ways he probably was more argumentative than Snyder. I mean, the Snyder
Hmm.
than a Spinrad or Sturgeon or whomever. Now, but also I think the experience of people like David Gerald and some other and Melissa Snodgrass, yeah,
Hmm.
there were some part of the story I was also willing to believe because there are things about Gene Roddenberry over time that I've some also soured on as a person, right? He did seem to be willing to sort of center himself in a way that wasn't always appropriate, right?
No.
And one of the elements of the story that Ellison really stuck in his craw
Hmm.
for corroborated, so I don't think this is Ellison being an exaggerator, is that because in fact there was like an excerpt from maybe a TV guide interview or something like that, where and conventions and in interviews, Roddenberry would constantly say that well, one of the things that Ellison did in his original script was that he had Scotty selling drugs. Well, that's not true. Scotty's not
Hmm.
even in the script, and that's not who sold the drugs, right? Because in the
Right.
original script screenplay, there's some drug dealing going on. It's
Well,
not some
maybe we should just
accident.
summarize
So
the
yeah,
original script.
let's talk about the comparison now. But I mean, well, the reason I bring that up, and then let's talk about the script, is that there are clear ways in which Roddenberry was also helping make this a problem. So they're both, I think, at fault, regardless of other things we might could say about these guys. So yeah, we actually did read. So I did read the script. I skimmed it, but there was a comic book that was released, and I forget what
Hmm.
year it was now, where the original script was made into a visual. Harlan Ellison's "The City on the Edge of Forever," and it is, and I can confirm by having looked at the script, it is a faithful reproduction of the script that Harlan wrote. You want to talk about what the major deviations were?
Well, as you said, it starts out with a crewman who's selling drugs on the Enterprise,
Yes.
and that gets out of hand. He's discovered, and that rather than it being McCoy, who is kind of driven insane by an accidental injection of a drug, going down to the planet and going through the Guardian forever and messing up the timeline. It's this guy who's a real seedy, awful person.
Yeah, it's the
How
drug
he got
dealer,
in,
not the drug taker that does it.
yeah, the drug dealer,
Right.
which, like, how's this guy in Starfleet? But anyway, so he goes down to the planet, and then Kirk and Spock have to follow. Meanwhile, the Enterprise is actually there in the original, and in the TV series episode, the Enterprise just disappears. In
Hmm.
the original script, there's another Enterprise, but it's an alternate universe
It's the
one that's,
Condor, and it's a pirate ship.
it's a pirate ship. And so while Kirk and Spock are on their mission, the remaining crew who had beamed down to the planet and are now on the Enterprise are fighting off these pirates. And then, the story with Joan Collins's character is much the same, except there's like another guy who works in the
So
shelter. And
she's a sister. She's not at the shelter, but she's doing the same kind of stuff.
yeah,
In the Aired script, they take the guy that runs the shelter and her character and merge them into one, which actually make more sense narratively. It's more
yeah. I mean,
parsimonious.
yeah. I mean, it's a less essential detail, but like so Kirk and her fall in love,
Yeah.
just as they did in the TV show. And then in the ending, it's not. It's very different. So in
Yes.
the TV show, it's they're reunited. McCoy has managed to kind of shake off the effects of the drug. He's traveled through time. Kirk and Spock find out that they've been successful in getting there before he did in the timeline. They meet up on the street. And by this time, Kirk knows from Spock's research that his love here, Joan Collins' character, has to die.
Right.
That if she lives, she winds up interfering with the Roosevelt administration's willingness to get into the Second World War. Terrible things happen because of that. And so Kirk has to stop himself has to stop McCoy from saving her from being run over by a truck.
Hmm.
And it's an incredibly tragic moment, right?
Yes, it is.
Like McCoy
Yes, it
says,
is.
"Do you know what you just did?" And Spock
Yes.
says, "Yes, Doctor, he knows."
Yes.
Yeah.
No, it's yeah. In the original script, it's the
Mhm.
drug dealer that actually is going to save Joan Collins' character, and Spock stops him. And Kirk
Mhm.
can't act because he's in love. And Ellison didn't like this change because he thought that it was more dramatic for Kirk to be willing to sacrifice the future for this love,
Mhm.
which doesn't totally work for me. He didn't like the fact that the captain was the hero, which okay, fine, but he's trying to subvert, I guess, expectations in that regard. And of course, also in a very Harlan Ellison-esque way, at the end of the story, the drug dealer ends up being eternally punished for his crimes in a way
Yeah.
that was very, very Ellison-esque, in my opinion.
Yeah. Extremely Ellison-esque. But,
So,
fundamentally, I think, Joan Collins' character, Edith, is the same.
hmm
Fundamentally, the relationship with her and Kirk is the same.
hmm
Weirdly, the interactions between Kirk and Spock are not what you'd expect from the TV show.
agreed,
They're a lot harsher and like almost like they're two people who haven't worked together before.
agreed.
And anyway, and there are things that just don't quite fit Star Trek in a way.
Right. Which is fair to the degree that it was first season. This is first season, right?
Yeah.
Um, and Ellison didn't have all the background to go on. In fact, he inserts into the story, which of course is totally counter to the lore that ends up being developed, that the
Hmm.
humans actually went into space first and found the Vulcans,
Yes.
and it suggests a sort of weird colonial relationship that I thought
Yes.
was kind of odd.
Yeah.
But that's only odd because of what we know to happen, the way it happened, the way it unfolded.
Right.
Otherwise,
Yeah, but those are the kinds of things you would smooth over. Just someone would say,
right?
okay, I'll change
That's
this
right.
line here.
Sure. There's
It's a
also the
minor
inclusion
detail.
of this veteran from World War One trooper that apparently
Yeah.
Ellison was very upset that got taken out. I found that he was fine, but it was superfluous to the story ultimately, right? I mean, it
Yeah.
was just not. So,
Yeah. A wounded
yeah,
veteran of World War One who's,
yes,
kind of a living on the street and
hmm
sort of helpful
yeah,
to Kirk and Spock to a minor degree. But as you said, it didn't need to be there.
no, it did not need to be there.
Oh, and
And
the Guardians are forever are actual like humanoid
yes,
beings. They're not
yes,
the mysterious archway that you see in the
right,
TV version that was finally filmed. And
yes,
they reminded me of the Argonath from Lord of the Rings. Those giant statues. Yeah,
yes, yes. The
yeah.
way they're drawn in the comic, that's
In the
exactly
comic,
correct.
yeah.
Yeah, and Ellison was upset, and I kind of get this part that you write something called The City will Live Forever and you never actually see a city. And apparently, um, the script said they were runes,
Hmm.
Runes,
Yes.
and the set designer, the set construction guy, thought that was a typo for ruins, Ruins, and that's why they built the set that they did. And DC
Hmm.
Fontana confirms that in her essay because Ellison says it in his. I almost like, okay, that can't be true. That
Hmm.
just, but in fact, there was some production thing going on that even the Guardian of Forever, they were surprised what he built. But once
Yeah.
on that kind of schedule, you got it built, you're going to use it, right?
Hmm.
So I mean, there are minor things that I understand, like that there weren't actual Guardians, that it wasn't a city, but it was just a bunch of ruins. Okay, fine. I can understand why that would irk him. I still think it works pretty well. But and but I mean, you've already kind of said it, but let's be explicit. Which version did you find better?
Oh, the TV show,
Yeah,
easily. There's
yeah,
so many elements that are either kind of there's not they're neither good nor bad.
right.
the changes that were made and some that are definitely better. For example, the villain's fate at the end of the original
Yeah,
script
it's just yeah,
is just kind of silly. Like it's like
yeah.
he's thrown into the heart of the sun and is going to burn for eternity. It's
Basically, he's cast into hell. Basically, he's like it's a
yeah,
time loop where he dies in the heart of an exploding sun, but then it resets, so he just is constantly dying over and over and over and over again.
right. Well, that means that he resets and he doesn't experience the previous incarnations of himself being burned up. And anyway,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
was just sort of silly and overwrought. And I was glad that that character was written out completely. Like, what would it have added to like call into question Starfleet? That there are
Yeah,
people
yeah.
on board who are drug dealers.
Well,
Like
I do think that was clearly a case.
that would have really knocked the show off kilter.
I agree. Well, it really made it that whole scene where Beckwith and
Hmm.
Lebec are talking, and Beckwith is the drug dealer. It really felt like a different show. Like I'm
Yes.
just in space to make money, so I don't have to work anymore, kind of thing. And this drug dealer thing is going to be the way that I amass enough fortune to,
Hmm.
not have to do the space thing anymore. It was like
Right.
almost like working on an oil rig in Alaska to make money and then go home, which didn't comport with the way the show, even at that point, while it was still finding its way, did
Hmm.
not see itself. So there's that. I also think that, and I don't remember. I may be forgetting something from the comic and the script, but I found that there's a part of how they figure out who Joan Collins, Edith Keeler, why
Hmm.
she's pivotal, is because of a cryptic hint given to them by the Guardians about the color blue and something else.
Right.
And I much prefer the version of the aired version where Spock has to like construct a computer out of radio
Stone
tubes.
knives and
I love
bearskins.
that line. I love that line.
Yes.
Stone knives and bearskins. And he's figuring out where the disjuncture in time was. I
Yes.
found that much more interesting than the sort of the guesswork they do in the
Oh
comic.
yeah, like then why don't the Guardians just say
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
what
it's Edith Keeler.
I know, just say it. Not patch of blue and
Yeah,
that's just silly.
yeah,
I hate when writers do that. I
yeah,
hate
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
agree.
Why are the aliens being so cryptic
Yes,
when
exactly.
they can just be completely straightforward? This is what you need to fix. Good luck to you.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I mean
I
the
agree.
pacing of the original version is a bit slow,
I agree.
which
I agree.
I didn't get that feeling from the TV version.
I think the original script would have had to have been trimmed. I don't think you could have fit it into
Oh
45
yeah,
minutes.
no,
Ah, well, there's
yeah,
that. I mean, it's an interesting exercise. I do find it intriguing, right, to see how this kind of works. You write something, and but again, this is the kind of the point I was getting at before, and why I think this is an interesting illustration of Ellison's sort of point of view.
hmm
I don't see anything here that is necessarily unreasonable.
hmm
Now, except for the way Roddenberry talked about it after the fact, and I understand why that irked Ellison. I do.
yeah,
And I do feel like, and I already had this impression before I read all this stuff, that, Roddenberry kind of wanted to take credit for it, and Ellison felt slighted by that. And I think that's fair because the basic story is still there. The basic structure of the
yes,
story is
hmm
present
Well,
from
the
the
essence
original
of the
treatment.
story,
Yeah. And there's some important deviations, and that's just television,
yeah,
as I
but again,
understand
at
it.
the
But
essence of it, like so many of the things that we're saying we didn't like uh, about the original script were
yeah.
also the most eminently discardable parts. Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
okay, whatever the problems are about having this drug dealer on the Enterprise,
Right.
the drug dealer Enterprise had nothing to do with the basic story here, which is about
No.
time traveling and the tragedy of having to let this woman die
Yes.
and so forth. That was the essence of the story. And you didn't need the World War One veteran. You
No.
didn't need a whole lot of the things that got cut. Good for them.
No. In fact, I was going to say a minute ago, and you
Mhm.
reminded me, I think this as an episode works better that there isn't actually a bad guy. There is no
Yes.
antagonist in that sense. The
Yes.
antagonist is about the circumstance.
Right.
And I don't need some guy at the end who has to I mean, you can cut the 2 minutes just from this guy being punished to get
hmm
screen time. It just doesn't even, you don't even need it. How does that service the story? I
Well,
I don't see
it's
it.
distracting. Like
It is
you should be
distracting.
focused
It's a good
on
word for it.
the tragedy, not this other thing that suddenly happens, with the villain getting thrown into the heart of his son.
I also, I'll go ahead and say this too, because as I think about the ending of the original script versus the other ending, and I agree with you, the scene on the street where Kirk stops McCoy from saving Keeler, and he asks Kirk, "Do you know what you've just done?" And Spock says that he does know, and then the fact that they then basically from there they just back in the future, and all that happens is Kirk says, "Let's get the hell out of here," which is the only
Yeah.
time I think he says hell in the entire series, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say that. That very spare last scene,
Yeah,
right?
was
It doesn't,
far better
again,
than.
it doesn't, like no one's, saying, "Oh, too bad, that this
That's
happened to
right.
you." There's nothing. There's no further expedition. We all know what has happened. We all
Yeah,
still feel it, and just like, let's get the hell out of here.
because
Perfect.
there's an epilogue
Yeah.
in this comic that just is it's just too much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
That's how I felt. I was like, I wanted to be
yeah,
over at that point. The story is done.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. So I mean, now it's worth pointing out that the original script did win the Writers Guild Award for original screenplay, and I Dorothy Fontana's essay did point out that that's a blind. It's a blind contest in the sense that
Hmm.
the committee did not know who wrote the script, so
Right.
that's the one that they judged. It also the aired version won the Hugo. So I mean, it clearly had cachet, right?
Had
And
resonance with
it's
people.
certainly, yeah, and it's persisted in its significance. But anyway,
Yeah.
so it's unfortunate there was a big feud, but it is a sort of interesting artifact of this
Hmm.
entire process. Any other
Hmm.
thoughts about Sitting on the Edge of Forever?
No, it's still a great episode.
Hmm.
But everybody needs an editor.
Yes, yes, indeed. All right. So before we conclude here, are there any other TV related thoughts that are relevant to this week that you want to talk about?
No, I'll just mention, we're going to do one more episode. We're going to talk about two more adaptations. One was a TV series that Ellison helped conceive and launch that he
Hmm.
was really unhappy with, and we'll give
He
our
gave it the
thoughts.
bird.
Yeah, he gave it the bird, and we'll talk about how justified his outrage was at that, and also a movie adaptation of a short story we didn't talk about in the last episode, A Boy and His Dog.
So yeah, we'll talk about the novella and we'll talk about the movie
Yeah,
as an adaptation. I've
yeah,
more thoughts about that at least at the moment than I do about the other,
yeah.
but there'll be plenty to
But
talk
we'll
about. I
save
will,
it.
yeah, we'll save it. I will say one thing I meant to mention a moment ago, just because it's kind of a fun trivia thing. Speaking of Soldier, right? There is an
Yeah.
episode. There's an issue of the Incredible Hulk written by Bill Mantlo
Hmm.
that almost that did steal the story of Soldier,
Yeah.
and Ellison noticed it and then complained and threatened a lawsuit, but apparently they settled and he got a writer's credit in subsequent printings,
Hmm.
including if you look on the Marvel Unlimited app, it's on there. And he got apparently a lifetime access to all Marvel comics from there on out, which is a pretty good deal, I would think.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Whom do I have to
it's
sue to get that?
that's right. So if they ever steal an episode of Agent Geeks, we'll get free comics. I think that's the way that works.
Okay, excellent.
So again, I don't have merch is it's hard on these kinds of episodes, but
No.
here's what I thought about. It's not a great question to be honest, but are there any of the stories from last episode or any that we didn't talk about that you would think would be good to be adapted for the screen?
I think Jeff D is five.
Oh,
I
you
think that
stole
would be
mine.
the
You
most
stole it.
filmable.
I agree.
Yeah, I think it might be a little hard given the timing.
Hmm.
Now that, okay, the story was written in 1977, so referring back to old radio and the
Yes,
serials and so forth, I don't know what that would be like 50 years
that's
later.
fair. That's totally fair.
Those media don't really exist anymore, or that form of media don't exist. But I think I think that the whole nostalgia
Hmm.
story would work very well nowadays because there's a lot to talk about in nostalgia and geek in the geek world, and how it's used or abused. So that would be the one. And again, it's the most one of my favorite stories, one of the most straightforward plots.
Hmm.
It could really flesh out to an hour TV episode pretty easily.
Well, since you stole mine, I'll say Chatting for Anubis because I don't like that story and I don't want to watch it on television. No, it's
Oh,
not.
okay. And maybe the Whimper of Whip Dogs. I could be.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah. I think an animated version of Repent Harlequin said the TikTok Man might be doable.
That could be doable.
Yeah,
That's fair.
that could be fun.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Hey, you could have a talk show called Chatting with Anubis.
There you go.
That might work. Kind of like. Okay, now I have an idea. Right? It's kind of like
Okay.
Space Ghost Coast to Coast,
Right.
except you're chatting with Anubis.
Yeah. Or the Dr. Zayas show.
All the that's
Yeah.
that's right. Hanging with Dr. Z.
But
All right.
I did actually think of merchandise.
Okay, go for
I
it.
think a talking Guardian of Forever paperweight would be pretty
Okay,
cool.
that's totally fair.
If it like occasionally remind me of tasks, the timeline needs you to seed the lawn.
I what are you, the groundskeeper? Yeah, that's funny. That's a good one. I should have thought about. There was more merch opportunities because of the TV shows.
Mm,
It's along the same lines of the various versions of Alexa. Yeah, you can have a whole Alexa line, right? You could have the Zen Alexa, the 8
mm,
edition board computer Alexa, and you could have
yeah,
the Guardian Legion Forever Alexa.
right. The Marvin the Paranoid Android Alexa.
Sure, absolutely.
Oh, you want me to answer this question? Do you know how large my intelligence is, and
That's
I'm
right.
wasting it on this?
You want me to subscribe to Birdseed, brain the size of a planet? Yeah, exactly. All right. On that happy note, we'll see you next week for one more foray into Alice in Wonderland. See you next week.
See you then.
Before we jump through the time portal to the next episode, we just want to thank you yet again for listening to another episode of Ancient Geeks. On the podcast app or platform of your choice, please like and subscribe and leave us a review. Or send us comments directly at someancientgeeks@gmail.com. Look for us at our Substack, someancientgeek.substack.com, as well as other social media such as Facebook, Reddit, and Blue Sky. All content is copyright 2026, Tom Grant and Stephen Taylor. Music by Reversed Image, who you can find on Pixabay. See you next time.
I'm trapped in the building with the Kaiban. There's a woman with me. We can't escape. Tell me, what can I do?
100% possibility of success is not available. Next success quotient only 47% probable.
Well, tell me, what is it?
Let them kill you.